Testing, testing, testing. 1, 2, 3.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to start in the next 5 minutes. We will start in the next 5 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start in 1 minute. Please find your seats.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Plug and Play Smart Cities Innovation Day. Super excited to have you guys here today. Seems like a good crowd, combination of corporations, startups. We have representatives from government, so very exciting day. We have a really good lineup of speakers and panel today for you guys, but before we do anything, I would love to invite Plug and Play CEO Saeed Amidi and Supervisor Asha Safai on the stage for the quick opening remark. Thank you, guys.
Again, I wanted to welcome you. And, this smart city, I talked to some people in the audience saying, what does smart city represent? And we are trying to shape the smart city initiative here in Silicon Valley today. And if you ask me, we feel real estate is part of smart real estate is very important to make the building more efficient, etc. Then the traffic in the city, the lights, and especially as we go to autonomous vehicle, and I don't know about you guys, but there is so many scooters now in San Francisco, we feel the safety in the city is really, really important. So we combine our sustainability, safety, construction, real estate, all under the umbrella of smart city. And what we hope to do is to bridge the gap between entrepreneurs who are working on mobility, IoT, and we are very pleased to have Asha here from City of San Francisco, and he has been actually working on innovation and all the effort from City of San Francisco. So I'd love to, Asha, first, if you could little bit introduce yourself,
Sure.
as well as to tell us what are the challenges a city like San Francisco has, and how could our entrepreneurs help that? And then what are the opportunities? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Saeed. Good morning, everyone. Are you awake? Yes. All right. So thank you, Saeed. Thank you to Plug and Play. Thank you to all of you innovators for being here today. So one of the things that you probably realize when you come to San Francisco is there's cranes everywhere. And it just feels like we've been in a constant state of construction even before the Great Recession came to an end. We were one of the first harbingers of the economy turning around. I can remember, I have a background in city planning, but I've also worked with organized labor. I've also done real estate and construction. I've worked with nonprofits. I've worked inside of government and outside of government. I can remember the day walking down Market Street talking about what we like to call the Twitter tax break. Because Twitter was this little startup company that started in the Mission area, then moved over to Market Street, and was confronted with how it can stay and grow and survive in San Francisco. So we had what was called a payroll tax, and that payroll tax got in the way, and many thought it penalized companies for hiring employees. So we did away with the payroll tax, and they called it the Twitter tax break. All of a sudden, here we are 6.5 years later, 7 years later, and you can't even imagine what San Francisco was like before the beginning of the second coming of all of these new companies. So some of the challenges that we face because of our strong economy, because of the constant construction is, we're confronted with issues of transportation, how to get to point A to point B, getting people from their home to their jobs in an efficient way. So as Saeed said, there are scooters everywhere. And we tried to do it in a very kind of constrained way, but just recently, we opened up 10,000 more scooters to come onto the streets. A lot of that has to do with, we want people out of their cars. We don't want people in their cars in San Francisco. So how can we innovate around that? Another problem is, we're creating more office space probably than any other urban area that is constrained on all sides. We have millions of square feet of office space coming for new employees, but we don't have millions of square feet of housing for those employees to live in. So there's a limited resource of housing, there's constraints on transportation, and then because of the housing crisis and the affordability, we see the result of that on the street. Many of the people that you see, not the hardcore homeless, if you've ever been to San Francisco, people that have mental health issues that look as though they've lived on the street for years, but there is a growing population of people that have just become homeless within the last year. A lot of that has to do with the rising cost of housing and the pressures on the housing market. So transportation, housing, jobs, office space, homelessness, these are all of the things that we are confronted with and challenged with in San Francisco. And then we have our environmental policy. So this is one of the things that I worked on that I shared with Saeed, that we innovated around how San Francisco can be a leader in getting to zero waste. How can we send zero amount of our waste to landfills? And we worked on that. So these are all the things that we're working on and confronted with, that we're challenging all of you to think about. We want to provide the space. We want to provide the innovation. And so it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you here today. What an amazing organization and space to be a part of. I'm very honored to call Saeed my friend, and I'm honored to be part of this day today. So get to innovating. Thank you very much.
So I want you to
I'm not
stay
leaving.
there. You're not leaving yet. So let me tell you, I think it was only 2 days ago I was driving to work, and on NPR there was a program about Penn University. They called Penn University a little city. I believe it's in Pittsburgh. 65,000 people live, work, go to school there. And specifically, they decided they would like to be much more carbon neutral. So they reduced their consumption of energy by 50%. And I think like any small city or big city can benefit from smart city initiative. And I want to use one more example. We are very proud to work with the Airport of Vienna. Airport of Vienna, it's 26,000 people go to work there. It's like a little mini city. And by next quarter, they will be actually positive carbon footprint. They have reduced their consumption of electricity. It's really funny. I go to the CEO's office, and his light is off. In the hallways, the light is off. And it takes you about 10 minutes to get used to it, but there is enough light to turn the light off. And they have pillars that go down about 20 meters. And in the winter, they take heat from the ground and they heat the building. And in the summer, they take cool from the ground to cool the building. I tell you, it was like an incredible little city that is going to go positive. Are you going to become positive footprint in San Francisco soon?
We are. They just actually brought a piece of legislation the other day. One of the biggest producers of CO2 are people's homes and buildings. And so, like this building right now probably is creating CO2, right? So how do we think about that? So one of the things that we just produced the other day was a piece of legislation that said every single Class A, Class B office building over 50,000 square feet had to be 100% renewable energy for the source of power in the next, I think it's by 2030. Or actually, it's even more aggressive than that. I think it's 2025. So we gave them a certain amount of time, but we are a city that is producing its own power now. We have Clean Power SF. The second step that we did was we said all residential new construction, and this was just talked about last week, all new construction would have to be no longer using natural gas, would be 100% electric. because that way we can control the source of power and what's going into in terms of our carbon footprint there. So we are moving aggressively, San Francisco is. The innovation that I worked on was we have 3 streams of waste. You don't really see that in other parts of the Bay Area even. Composting, recycling, garbage. We require 3 streams of waste, and we require now, this is a piece of legislation that I worked on, every single building will be audited to see if they're meeting the standard of diversion, so they're not sending stuff to landfill. Once they're audited, if they fail that audit, they have to bring people in to come on site to sort their trash, to properly put it in place so we know that the garbage is going. So we're thinking about it in terms of electricity, trash, and getting traffic. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You know, if I can tell you what we intend to do with the Smart City platform here is to have, you know, City of San Francisco, City of San Jose. You know, in fact, I was quite surprised. There is a consortium here called Clean Energy of Silicon Valley. And the president came to see me, and he said, Saeed, you are my customer. I said, no. He said, okay, go. I brought a PG&E bill, and it says, yeah, 80% of what I pay monthly, which is a lot of money, it's about $50,000 a month, goes to this clean energy of Silicon Valley. I think it's about 10 counties around here, and they are up to 70% clean energy. So they pay a little more, but then they use PG&E to deliver it to me. And apparently they asked us about 2 years ago, do you want clean energy? We said yes. So we are working toward it.
So you're 70% of the way there.
That's right. I put you in the position, you put me in the position. No, but if I can tell you this innovation platform, we want to work with autonomous car, electric car, safety in the cities and in our roads, I think is really important. Then with this IoT devices and sensors, we're going to have more data than we know what to do with it. So we just have to use the data to improve the environment, improve everything else. And if I can, because today is the launch of Smart City, I would love to ask the audience if you have ideas, if you have some things that you would like us to focus on, please let us know. The team is here, and we want to shape it that we all be part of it together. So with that, I wanted to thank Asha for being here.
Thank you,
and
Saeed.
if you guys have a question for Asha, we have maybe time for 1 or 2 questions.
Any questions for the city of San Francisco?
It's the most beautiful city in the world.
All right. Okay, well, thank you,
Thanks so
everyone.
much, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Asha. Thank you, Saeed. It's exciting to be here, and I think like both of them talk about some of the challenges that we have here, from transportation, mobility, to real estate, to energy. And I was talking to Bijan earlier. It took him 2 hours to get to this event. So these are the challenges that every one of us we feel, and I think at the end of the day, there's no 1 or 2 people can solve any of these problems. That's why this importance of having events like this, to have combination of corporations, government, startups to collaborate and work together to solve these issues and challenges. And with that, I would love to invite Jennifer, our innovation manager on the IoT side. She put a lot of effort into putting this event together. So please, round of applause for Jennifer.
Hi everyone, welcome also from my side. I'm super excited for the day. It's been a long month of planning and inviting speakers and making this a great agenda for you. So I'm really happy that the day finally came. So let's take a look at what's happening today. That's the agenda. We had opening remarks. Thank you, Asha. Thank you, Saeed. Thanks very much. We will start with a very interesting keynote from Jeff from World Economic Forum in a bit. After that, we'll hear 3 best practice presentations of different corporates and startups who have actually had a very great impact on creating the smart cities of the future already. And after that, we'll have a cross-industry panel who's going to discuss the impact of autonomous vehicles in the urban places we live in. Then we have a great lunch outside on the patio, so please be invited for networking and a great lunch outside. And then after lunch, we're going to start with fantastic keynote again by Radha Mistry, who's talking about grappling with the future, and she's kind of virtually drawing the prototypes of the cities of the future. Then we'll have a city fireside chat. So we have some of the cities of the Bay Area and Smart Dubai actually being on stage to talk about their urbanization strategies, which is followed again by 3 best practice presentations from corporates and startups. Lastly, we have 3 startup pitches on stage. So if you want to engage with some of our entrepreneurs here today, they're here to pitch for you. And then we'll have a quick takeaways of the day to see what we have learned today. I have 2 special things that I'd like to point out. First, our partner Strategy of Things is giving a very nice breakout training session just in the room San Francisco behind the wall. You'll see signs guiding you there. It is about innovating with municipalities, so if you want to get into business with cities and government, you should attend this training. It's really nice. It's 90 minutes. And lastly, but also very important, and because I'm German, very important for me too, we'll have Oktoberfest today, starting at 4. I'm going to change, so I hope you all brought your dirndls and lederhosen. So I'm looking forward for some nice networking after this event. A few organizational things. We have an event app where you can see the entire agenda of the day, information about the speakers, and where you can also do some networking. So you can download the event app and then just log in, looking for the Smart Cities Innovation Day event, and then you can automatically interact with everybody. And then second, we decided to do on-stage Q&A. So we're using Slido. You can either just use the web application or download the app to raise questions in real time. The moderators or master of ceremony will receive it on their phones and then ask the questions on stage. So, but before we start the agenda, let's quickly talk about why we're here today. And Saeed and Asha already pointed it out very well. I think the urbanization trends and the population explosion, coupled with economic growth in some of the major areas of the world, are putting a lot of pressure on the cities that we live in and the urban areas we live in. So there's definitely a need to act right now. And this need means we need to increase efficiencies in the cities, quality of life, and ultimately solving our everyday problems. And while this has been in the discussions for so many years already, we felt like the past has been about experimentation very much. It's actually a very good time to talk about it now, because for the first time we see that technology is evolving. We have 5G being rolled out. We have AI which can deal with the massive data sets that we have today. We see that there's actually a purpose. We see that the solutions for smart cities can solve the everyday problems. And we also see that there's a good return on invest when you invest in smart city projects. So that's why we think right now is a really good time to talk about smart cities, and also one reason why we are kind of launching it again at Plug and Play.
And maybe I can add one more thing. Like, it was, I think, about 3-4 years ago, we had a smart cities event in the same room with the CIO of Palo Alto, Mountain View, Santa Clara, and we had a big crowd here. But I think maybe 3-4 years ago, government wasn't that ready to embracing these innovations. And now with a bigger platform that we have in Plug and Play, within the IoT mobility real estate, we work with about 85 different corporations. So we have a strong corporate network, we have a very strong startup network, and with bringing government to this platform, we try to create like more synergies and more collaboration. And maybe like, this time is a different time than 3-4 years ago.
Exactly right. And it's really our vision to become, or to be, the platform where the cities of the future are being created. And this is why we're opening up the Open Innovation Platform. We have been very strong in the past with our startups and corporates and venture capital in the private sector side, but we're opening up to public sector. We're inviting city councils and government and universities to become members of the platform and innovate for the smart cities of the future.
Yeah, and then as Said also mentioned, the way that we look at the smart cities, like a lot of things are involved within smart city. Health is part of it, but the way that we want to define it is urban mobility and transportation is a big part of it. Mobility, real estate and construction and connected home is another piece of it. Sustainability and energy is another piece, and the fourth one is IoT and infrastructure in general. So we try to create an umbrella of these four verticals under smart city and create synergies and collaboration between corporates, startups, and government. And lastly, this is not the only place that we have smart city. Beginning of 2019, we launched smart cities in Paris. So that's one of the strong programs that we have over there. As Said also mentioned, we have partnership with Vienna International Airport in Austria. In Bangkok, my colleague Sean is also here. We launched about a month ago. We have a smart city innovation platform in Bangkok, Thailand. Silicon Valley as our headquarters, we have an umbrella approach of smart city, as I mentioned. Same thing, Tokyo. There are other opportunities that we're exploring around the world to expand this platform. But the whole point is we want to connect startups not only in one place, connect them in the whole global platform that we built to create collaboration and good synergies between everyone.
Well, that leaves us just to wish you a very great day today. And I would immediately hand over to the first speaker of today. Actually, fun fact, he grew up in a very, very rural area in western Pennsylvania, far from any city life, but he became very obsessed with cities after living 20 years in New York. I mean, who doesn't become obsessed with city life not living in New York? It's fantastic there. So I'd like to welcome on stage Jeff Merritt from World Economic Forum. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone.
Morning, everybody. My objective here is really to frame the day. I'm being a little selfish here, but I want to sort of make sure that we're starting out on the right foot, and that when we're thinking about smart cities, that we're thinking about why we're doing this. We're thinking about sort of who at the end of the day are we developing products for, what are the services that we're trying to deliver, what is the impact that we're trying to achieve. And that may sound pretty obvious to you, but I actually think we've been getting it wrong for quite some time. We're not at the beginning of the smart city movement. We've been talking about smart cities now for 15 years at least. And more often than not, what we're talking about is cities like this. And this isn't a dig at my colleague Andrew from Dubai, but rather we're increasingly always talking about these bright, shiny objects, these cities that at the end of the day are anomalies. These are not your sort of typical cities around the world. These are cities that in some ways have massive advantages. I mean, I worked for the city of New York for 8 years and was a director of innovation, and I loved that job, but I recognized at the end of the day that not every city has a $90 billion budget and 325,000 employees that every day can keep a city running and innovating. Most cities actually around the world look a little bit more like this, right? And when we're thinking about smart cities, we need to think about who are we actually trying to help? Are we trying to sell a lot of products and services, or are we actually trying to shape the cities of the future? And if you're shaping the cities of the future, you need to actually focus on what are the real cities out there around the world. If you look at what's happened over recent decades, this is just a bit of a time lapse, we're seeing massive, massive expansion of our cities, right? In 1950, you had about 750 million people in cities. Today, 4.2 billion people. And if you see where those dots are growing, they're not just growing in Europe and in the US and places like that. They're growing in Africa, they're growing in India, they're growing in China. So yes, we can make Palo Alto and Silicon Valley look pretty, but are we actually changing the world? Are we actually shaping the future? I say no. So by 2050, and it's not actually that far away. I mean, oftentimes we use these numbers and you can think, oh, 2050. No, I mean, we're talking about, our lifetimes, right? In our lifetimes, we're going to see, an additional 2.4 billion people in cities. This is a massive, massive growth. Just to put that practically, each and every week, 3 million people moving into cities. Let me say that again. 3 million people moving into cities each and every week. So if you play that out, what that actually means is that we've got to be developing cities really, really rapidly. We've got to find a place to put these people. We have to find a way to move people efficiently. If you thought your commute here today was bad, think about what lies in the future ahead. Think about some of these other cities that don't have as many resources as we have here in the Bay Area. So in the coming years, we're going to have to build a city roughly the size of Singapore, the size of Miami, every single month. This isn't just about sort of building pretty buildings that operate efficiently. This is actually about managing massive, massive concentrations of people in small spaces. So I think first, if you're going to talk about smart cities, let's really understand the problem at hand. Let's understand the opportunity that we have and why we are developing these technologies. If we fail, and I think you could actually look around the world and say we might be failing right now. If you look at what's happening in cities around the world, we are really sort of pushed to the limits. If you fail to manage concentrations of people, if you fail to create efficiencies here, schools can't operate. We see outbreaks and epidemics. We see massive violence. We see congestion that shuts down economies. So this really, I'm not trying to use hyperbole here. This is the reality that we live in today. We have no choice but to figure out how to make our cities more efficient, more productive. The economy depends on it. The livelihood of billions of people depend on it. You know, we used to always talk about smart city technologies as like a good to have, or that was always the feeling. Like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had sensors that, made it so that you could speed through intersections more efficiently, that you could, decrease your energy bill by 20%. This is actually must-have in this day and age. And I want you to remember that, and I want you to sort of think about that very carefully as you're looking at what are the actual problems that you're trying to solve. This is definitely easier said than done. I said that I worked in a city that was very, very well resourced. We didn't know all of the connected devices around the city. If I wanted to figure out what an actual sensor was up on a street pole, I'd have to go over to the Department of Transportation with a photo, and they'd have to sort of walk around trying to figure out what it was. It is incredibly difficult to manage the rapid, rapid pace of growth that we're facing of technologies as well, even if you're in a well-resourced city. The problems here for cities are massive. Cyber threats. Every single one of these devices that we roll out is a potential vector of attack, right? You need to be thinking about, has anybody seen the movie Italian Job? There's two versions of it, but one of the scenes I love there is where some hackers go and they just basically shut down the city, take over the traffic lights so they can basically rob a bank and get out of the city. They basically shut down the lights so all the traffic stops except for the way they want to go. This isn't some sort of sci-fi make-believe scenario. In New York City, every single one of our traffic signals is remotely controlled, right? So we have to think about security very, very seriously. Livelihoods depend on it. Efficiency of cities depend on it. We have to think about how we pay for this. If there's number one thing in my mind that slowed down the smart city movement, it's that we haven't actually had sustainable business models behind most of these products that we rolled out, right? Cities aren't designed to invest in new technology every year like a company might be. They think in decades, right? They think about building a bridge or a road that's going to still exist 100 years from now. Now they have to start thinking about a technology that could be obsolete by the time you roll it out on city streets, that constantly is going to need software upgrades and patches, right? So Financial sustainability is key here. Trust. Right? We're seeing this front and center in the news about Toronto as Sidewalk Labs is looking at rolling out sort of a city of the future. There's a lot of real concerns, right? If you're going to capture this data, what are you going to do with it? How do we ensure that we protect privacy? How do we ensure that we have adequate transparency, that the public actually understands what data you're capturing and what you're using? How do we prevent that sort of big brother scenario or Black Mirror type of world that's a real fear for us? And then you have these issues of equity. You have issues of interoperability. How do we ensure that as we roll out these technologies, that actually it goes the way we intended or planned? These are big, big issues. The good news here is that this isn't the first time at the rodeo for cities. Cities have constantly been disrupted over history. Right? If we look back 100 years ago, this is a scene, I think it's actually right about 100 years ago from New York City. This is, I think, around Midtown, 42nd Broadway area. I think it's around 1918 here that you saw the introduction of cars. And cars required cities to completely rethink the way that they operated, right? You had to rethink city planning because now actually you could have people that would be able to commute and be able to come into the city and move around. You could have goods that moved around the city. It really dramatically changed the day-to-day life of residents, the way in which economies worked, the way in which cities planned. And fortunately for all of us today, it didn't happen in a chaotic way. It did happen over a period of decades in terms of the rollout in this transformation. We don't have that luxury today. But what we see today, if you look at the impact of rolling out vehicles around the world, is you actually have global norms, right? The fact, it's pretty amazing that any of us here can go to a city around the world and we can actually get in a car and we know what to do, right? That there's some interoperability of policies there, right? That you see the same road signs. You have a concept of a speed limit. It might sound just basic to you, but that was a new concept. You didn't need speed limits when you had horse-drawn carriages. When you introduced cars and you had this risk that a car could actually kill people, cause harm, you had to think, oh, we actually need to monitor the speed of these vehicles. We actually have to set limits. But thankfully, we didn't go and try and get all of the world to do things exactly the same. Rather, what we did is we created interoperability of policies. And what I mean by that is we gave individual municipalities and jurisdictions the freedom to think about what is the speed limit that they thought was appropriate, right? And so you have places like Germany where you have the Autobahn and there is no speed limit. You have neighborhoods where you might have the speed limit being 25. We allow for flexibility. We allow for innovation in the policy space. But you also had the introduction of driver's licenses. You had the introduction of car insurance, right? We take for granted a lot of these basic foundational elements that make a technology work, right? And as we move into a future where connected devices are all around us, we can't forget that foundational policy infrastructure here. In fact, it's what's going to enable us to progress in a way that is beneficial, responsible, and ethical. So can we do this? Can we actually reach global norms and standards in this day and age? And this is not an easy day and age, right? This is an incredibly polarized world in which we live in today. Can we actually get countries around the world to align? The good news is actually, yes, we can. Tomorrow in Japan, in Yokohama, Japan, we're going to be formally launching a new initiative. It's called the G20 Global Smart Cities Alliance. This is the result of a good year's worth of work behind the scenes trying to get a lot of the biggest economies, the biggest governments around the world to actually agree that this is a problem, to agree that we couldn't have sort of one approach happen in the US, a whole entirely different approach happen in China, Russia, India, et cetera. That we had to begin to align upon common values, common principles, and begin to move towards a future that wasn't chaotic, but actually where we could control our own destiny, our future. And so tomorrow in Japan, we will announce our first set of institutional partners. Over 200,000 cities are represented in this network, as well as leading companies, startups, research institutions. Our goal here is to align. We don't want to reinvent the wheel here. In fact, there's a lot of great work that's been done around the world on individual policy issues. There's great innovations that are happening around cybersecurity, around interoperability. The problem is they're all out on islands. They're all sort of individual efforts out there. And what we need to do is we need to sort of pull those all together. And there's a model here for this, actually, on international cooperation. We're seeing this right now around climate change issues. And look, you can fault the Paris Agreement and you can fault some of the challenges that we're facing. Yes, we're not going fast enough in terms of addressing climate change, but we actually have built a general consensus around most of the world, and I say most, not all, that there is a common problem and that cities and individuals and companies have to take responsibility, right? And so with the Paris Agreement, we actually moved individuals, companies, cities, and other governments to actually set tangible targets to track their progress to make sure that they were actually being responsible. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing here with this new initiative. We're focused on 5 key principles, key values, and believe it or not, we actually got these G20 countries. We actually got China, the US, India, Russia, Turkey, South Africa, some of the most diverse countries around the world to sort of agree that these are important, that we actually have to align on these. Issues of privacy and transparency, safety, security, resiliency of our cities, the interoperability and openness of our smart connected devices and networks, operational financial sustainability, and last but certainly not least, this issue of equity, inclusion, and who is actually the beneficiary of these technologies. And so over the next few years, we're going to be building this out. We will be following that model of not only setting forward a roadmap, what are the policies that cities and governments need to be putting in place, but how do we actually hold them accountable? How do we ensure that cities are not simply saying, yes, we're sustainable, yes, we are concerned about financial sustainability, but actually they have policies in place to ensure that. There's a few different ways that you guys can get involved. This website will go live tomorrow when we launch this initiative. This isn't just about governments, and I think that's very important. Earlier on, it was referenced Penn University being sort of a city in itself. Each of your companies, each of your organizations is essentially a city in itself. You, I'm sure, are deploying smart technologies. If we look around this room, we can see some cameras, we can see some different sensors. Each one of us deploys smart devices, and we can set similar policies. We can set the sort of foundational structure that we want cities to follow. So there's a few ways that you can get involved in this. One, you can pledge your support. This does take a diverse community. It doesn't happen overnight. We need to have a steady drumbeat focusing on the urgency, focusing on the need for alignment. We're constantly going to be accepting in policies that should be norms, right? This isn't about a group of people getting together behind closed doors and coming up with the policies that will shape your lives. This is about actually understanding where do we have policies, be it in cities, be it in the private sector, that should be spread globally and should become the norms in the same way that we establish norms around speed limits and safety in transportation. We'll be having a number of different policy workshops as we roll this out. And last but certainly not least, we're really looking for cities, for organizations to actually pilot these policies to demonstrate your commitment through action here. Now, if we go back to where I started here in these two very different types of cities, I think the last point I want to sort of leave you with here is understanding that every time we roll out a new technology, in particular a new sort of IoT or smart technology, we're doing one of two things. We are either exacerbating inequalities or we are alleviating and tackling them. And let me tell you what I mean by that. When you roll out a connected device, essentially what you're doing is you're moving towards automation, right? You're moving towards being driven by real-time data. You're creating efficiency. You're creating cost savings. If we roll out those technologies only in the well-resourced areas, every dollar in those communities, in those governments, in those organizations goes further. That means that the wealthier just keep doing more better, and everyone else is further and further behind. However, if we're able to ensure that these technologies are rolled out in the places where resources are most scarce, that enables them to move ahead and for us to begin to bridge a bit of this divide between these two very different worlds that we're seeing developed around us. I'll end there and wish you all a great day.
Thank you, Jeff. We have just time for a couple of questions. And for those of you who haven't downloaded it yet, make sure you get Slido. You download it and you type in hashtag SCID as in Smart City Innovation Day. We'll be taking the questions there. But yeah, so a couple of questions we have on here already are, you previously worked for the City of New York as Director of Innovation. So what key lessons have you learned that you can pass on to other cities that aim to be smarter in general?
So let's see. You know, obviously we talk a lot about public-private partnership. You can't underscore the importance of this, and what I mean by that is thinking through the business models. I think one of my probably most successful initiatives in New York was the rollout of something called Lync Nyc. It was 5-borough citywide Wi-Fi. And the reason that was so innovative, and I should say it was innovative, but it wasn't without controversy. That one sort of image that you saw up there was somebody being stabbed by a sort of Google location target was actually sort of us being sort of attacked, concerns about that initiative. The reason that it was successful is that it didn't actually require a single dollar of taxpayer money. It was a long-term investment by a diverse group of companies who came together to invest in the city's infrastructure and to think creatively about how they could leverage connectivity and also, at the end of the day, not only pay for their investment in infrastructure, but make money. And if we're not thinking really creatively about those revenue generation opportunities, if we're not thinking about how, what is the use of all of this data, we will fail. And so I think that's was one of my big learnings, that if you don't go into any of these problems thinking about the revenue generation, how you're going to pay for this for years ahead, how you're going to keep evolving this technology, you're setting yourself up for failure. It's not something that you can sort of figure out later on. With cities, either you build it, you sort of design it for sustainability, or it will die.
Okay. We've got a number of questions that are beginning to roll in, so go through maybe one or two more. So let's say you're in the audience and you're a brand new director of innovation for any city out there. I guess, which technologies would you focus on first and why?
Okay, so I think that the key here is to, think about what's already out there in your city. Most folks think that you're starting from sort of scratch, but actually most cities have a lot of sort of data that they're capturing that they're not using efficiently. And the hardest thing is to transition from a sort of analog world into a dynamic world, right? To be able to move systems so that they're being fed by real-time data. So I think you got to start with sort of the low-hanging fruit. You got to think about what data are you actually capturing that you're not fully ingesting and using. You might find that in a space like sanitation, right? How do you actually move to dynamic scheduling and sort of dynamic routing of trucks as opposed to just a fixed schedule, right? It's about building that culture of agility in government that is the hardest part. You know, government has a lot of rigid rules for valid reasons, and it's going to be hard to get government to move towards a data-driven reality. So start with the data that you already have that you're just not using. Begin to use that to move towards more dynamic, reactive policies. Start with the low-hanging fruit. Don't take on anything too big.
New York when Michael Bloomberg was like the mayor, and what do you think about him?
So I worked under two administrations. I worked under Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor de Blasio. I think most people think of these two personalities as very different, actually very similar. And the way that they're very similar is that they focused on the big picture. They focused on the vision. Where do you want to see a city in the future? And so with Mayor Bloomberg, this was I think 2007, he put in place a strategic plan called Plan NYC. How do you balance economic growth with sustainability? Everything flows from a strategic plan. If you lack a sort of vision of where things need to go, you can't actually put in place these type of smart city systems. And Mayor de Blasio just sort of took that one step further and integrated in issues of resiliency, issues of equity, and now also the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so once you actually have that vision to lead by, then it becomes much easier for cities to plan for the future, to think about what is it that we actually need the technology for. Because if you're just adopting technology without that clear understanding of how you're going to track its value, what are your sort of KPIs, your metrics that you're showing that that technology was a good investment? If you don't go in with that, you're lost. And I think both Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor de Blasio were very strong leaders because they led with vision and then they trusted their city employees to execute on that in whatever way they felt possible.
Okay, just one more. It's gotten a number of upvotes, and so I have to make sure I read it. Are there any initiatives from the World Economic Forum to develop rural regions so that people could stay, live, or work from there? So are there any initiatives from the World Economic Forum to develop the rural regions so that people can stay, live, or work from there?
Yes. Now, the World Economic Forum's a massive entity. For those of you who may not be familiar, in addition to holding this event that people know in Davos, they are the International Organization for Public and Private Cooperation. So it's a platform by which companies and governments and civil society get together to tackle really, really big challenges. Rural communities are, in fact, a significant challenge. Finding a way to sort of ensure that these communities are economically viable. The reason that people move to cities is for economic opportunity. Cities are the real driver of our economies. And so I think a lot of the good work that's happening, the work that I'm excited about in rural communities is things like looking at how do we advance precision agriculture? How do we think about sort of more sustainable methods for generating energy, for generating electricity, for protecting and growing sort of our natural resources. So that's a big focus. You'll see efforts that are the World Economic Forums, like the Global Battery Alliance, thinking about how do we be more sustainable about the actual collection of raw materials for batteries and the sort of reuse of those. We have to change in many ways our economy to be much more circular, and as we move towards that more sort of sustainable economy, we can create more jobs that are not only in cities but in rural communities as well.
Perfect. All right, just a round of applause for Jeff. Thank you. Okay, I know we're running a little bit behind here, so we're just going to keep on moving. Just because I didn't get a chance to do it a moment ago, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Adam Janssen. I'm an innovation manager for the mobility team here at Plug and Play. And, you know, we're really excited about this event. There's a great turnout. Really happy to see that. Are you guys excited? All right. Before we go any further, though, I do want to just take a moment and recognize one of my colleagues who spent countless hours putting together this event. Jennifer Elfman, who's probably talked to every single speaker and half of you attendees, so just one round of applause for her, please. All right, so our next group of speakers, the first one is going to be talking about best practices in the area of public transit efficiency and reliability. His name is Johnny Simkin. He's a co-founder and CEO of Swiftly, which is a mobile operating system that empowers mass transit agencies to provide more efficient, reliable, and seamless transportation. They've rolled out to 60 cities, 2,500 transit professionals, and over 1.5 billion trips per year. And on top of all that, he's incredibly good at ping pong. He once took second place in the California State Ping Pong Games under 17 division. So also just know he never backs down from a challenge. Please welcome Johnny. Yeah, of course.
All right. Hi, everyone. So yes, if you do want to play ping pong, feel free to find me after. I haven't played in about 15 years, but I'm sure I'm still not too bad. Well, great to meet you all. So I'm Johnny. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO at Swiftly, and we are a big data platform for transportation. Now, this is why I started the company. So I was born and raised in San Diego. I drove everywhere growing up. And when I sold my first company, I moved up to San Francisco, and I was living in the city and driving down to San Mateo for my daily commute. And I got fed up with traffic. And I would always ask myself, why don't they just add more lanes to the freeway? It seems like, you know, it's kind of might be expensive, it might take a while to build, but they should just be able to add more lanes to the freeway. And as I started to research that, I found this. So this is a 50-lane traffic jam in China. And what happens is when you add more lanes, you generally induce more demand. When you induce more demand, you end up with more traffic. So this has a huge impact on us in the US and really the entire world. In the US alone, about 7 billion hours are wasted with people stuck in traffic, not being able to be productive. That, in turn, results in $160 billion worth of lost productivity. And transportation represents a third of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. So as we saw in the keynote before my speech, if you think this is bad, globally speaking, it's a much larger problem, and it's only going to get worse as populations continue to increase and as urbanization continues to drive some of the population growth into some of our cities. So there's a lot of talk around autonomous vehicles, and I'm sure there'll be more discussion around that later today. But I wanted to present this. So this is the movement efficiency of different modes of transportation. So you see the cars with single occupancy, so it's one person per vehicle on the left. You can move around up to 1,600 people per hour. And then on the far right, we see mass transit. You can move 25,000 people per hour. So that's about 15x the efficiency of movement of people. And as we think about our cities, right, we can't widen our streets. We're not going to knock down buildings and widen our streets. We have to live with the network that already exists. And the only way to start resolving congestion is to drive efficiency on those streets. And mass transit is one of the best ways to do that. So that's why we found that it would be really important to invest more in mass transit networks and to drive efficiency starting there and ultimately get people out of their cars from driving alone and look into shared modes of transportation. So this is the future we think must happen, whether they're autonomous vehicles and no matter when those autonomous vehicles might hit the roads. You need an efficient core of mass transit and then the ability to connect to and from transit. So that's everything from walking, bikes, scooters, ride hailing, everything we see in the news the ability to connect to these modes to a very, very efficient and high-frequency mass transit core. But there's a big, big problem. Cities produce tremendous amounts of data, but they don't know how to use it efficiently today. And so when we went and talked with cities and transportation agencies, what we realized is most of the data analysis happens in Excel. If you're a major city, you cannot even load 1 day's worth of data into Excel. It crashes. So as a result, oftentimes there are one-off studies that take months where external consultants are hired to look at some large data set, and 9 months, a year down the road, you finish that study, and the entire landscape of the city has changed. A whole new mode like scooters has been introduced and is now being used by tens of thousands of people and taking hundreds of thousands of trips. So it was very clear that this approach wouldn't scale. And as you think about learning and the rate of iteration and how that impacts how cities can scale, the learning was happening too slow. 9 months to 12 months for a single project isn't what we need. And so that's why we built this. It's the first big data platform for public transit. We collect billions of data points per city per month. We integrate with the existing infrastructure that's already on board, buses and trains and all fixed route modes. So generally there's, if you've seen in the front where the driver is, there's a fare box system, there's security cameras on board, and there's also a computer-aided dispatch system. We take GPS feeds from all of these different onboard devices, we combine them so we have a high-fidelity picture of how that vehicle is moving, and then we build intelligence and predictive models on top of that. So there are 3 core ways that we work with cities. The first is real-time passenger information. So we have an algorithm that can more accurately predict the ETA of the next bus or train. As you can imagine, it's probably pretty frustrating when you open Google Maps or any other app and it says, be at the bus stop in 5 minutes. You get there, you saw the bus leave, and now you have to wait 20 minutes for the next one. So our job is to make sure that never happens. We power all of the data for the city. We send it to all of the LED signs, and we send it to Google Maps, City Mapper, Transit, all the apps that you might already use. The second thing that we do, and what we found is, it's awesome that we can predict when the bus will be at a stop, but it really feels bad when we tell passengers, I'm really sorry, your bus is going to be late. So how do we prevent these issues, these performance issues from occurring in the first place? So we use these forecasts to also look at bus bunching and gaps and on-time performance to see when buses are going to be running early, later on time, and we deliver that information in real time to the transit agency so they can proactively manage the fleet rather than reactively. And so now we're in those dark rooms, which you see on in movies with the TVs on the wall. Those are called operations control centers, and we're generally on those TVs helping the agency manage the fleet more efficiently. And then the third thing that we do is analyze these billions of data points to drive decision-making, whether that's from a planning or scheduling perspective. Should I add a bus-only lane here? We heard a little bit earlier around dynamic traffic signal control systems. We can actually send a signal to the traffic light to tell it to turn green if the bus is running late. So things like that that drive efficiency that you may never see but have a profound impact on your ability to use and rely on the transit network. So I wanted to cover 3 examples of how cities are using this platform to make transit more reliable and more efficient. The first is in Boston. Back in 2015, there is a winter that caused a ton of disruptions across the commuter rail system as well as the bus network. And passengers were complaining that they couldn't rely on the service because they didn't know where vehicles were, when they were going to arrive, or how to leverage the transit network to get to and from work. So what we did was we combined the legacy data that they had as well as new GPS trackers that they installed. So we knew where every bus was every couple seconds rather than before was every couple minutes. And then we applied our algorithms to drive more accurate information for passengers. So they saw a 12% ETA improvement, but perhaps the most important piece was a 52% reduction in the scenario where passengers would miss the vehicle, right? It's okay to have to wait at the bus stop for an extra 2 to 3 minutes, but if you miss the bus entirely and have to wait 20 minutes for the next one, that's a pretty devastating scenario, so we skew our algorithm to try to minimize those instances. The result has been tens of millions of trips per year. Passengers now have a better experience as a result of this algorithm, using the same apps and the same signs that existed before. All right, next one. So Austin Capital Metro. Very similar instance. They had a lot of complaints about the transit network. Congestion in Austin is a huge issue. And so we came in, we again combined these disparate feeds of GPS already on board the vehicle. We ran through our algorithms, we saw 30% improvement in accuracy. And what that's resulted in now, along with some service changes that they did to drive more frequency in some critical routes, is they're one of the few agencies in the country that's experiencing an increase in transit ridership. So a 4.3% increase in transit ridership. And they now have over 140 staff members using Swiftly every single month to drive decision-making across the agency. Before Swiftly, decisions were made in silos. The planning teams had one piece of data that they would use for their decisions, scheduling had another data set, operations had another data set, and so on and so forth. And what we've been able to do is create a unified data platform that drives smarter decisions across the agency. And when you start making smarter decisions, when you can do studies much faster, and you can learn much faster, you can ultimately increase ridership, decrease number of people driving in single occupancy vehicles, and start to move the needle around congestion. And third example is right here, actually, Santa Clara VTA. So the VTA had two issues. One was with the quality of real-time information. We did a ton of improvements there. I've already gone through two examples, so I won't discuss that in more detail. But I think the one that I wanted to talk about is really punctuality analysis and network performance. So VTA did a study, and they looked at the speeds of vehicles in their network. And it turned out that over the last 30 years, congestion has increased so much that it cost them $70 million per year more than 30 years ago to operate the exact same level of service as 30 years ago. So effectively no improvement in service, but $70 million per year more in operating cost. And to be able to drive efficiency and reduce that annual operating cost, they estimated it would be about $200 million of capital improvements to add a bus-only lane here, BRT here, smarter signals there, so on and so forth. And they couldn't get support broadly from stakeholders for $200 million worth of improvements. But by using Swiftly, they were able to find specific intersections or corridors that were contributing the most to those issues, so they could build micro projects to get a majority of the benefit at a fraction of the cost. And so now they've discovered many ways that they can work with the city and do capital improvement projects to save in the order of magnitude of tens of millions of dollars a year without having to spend $200 million. And that's all because we've reduced the time to do these studies. Things that took 2 weeks now take 5 minutes. Things that took months take a couple days. And the faster we can learn about network performance, the faster we can make changes and ultimately improve transportation. So if you are interested in learning more about public transit, come find me at lunch, and happy to talk more. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Johnny. So next up we have Brendan Fitzgibbon, who comes to us from Visa, where he's a senior director of global product strategy, where he leads the go-to-market strategy for Visa Direct. Formerly at Visa, he held a role leading public policy and government engagement advisory, in which he focused on the effects of payment industry. Before that, he held roles at Google, Audi, Kaiser Associates. And kind of a fun fact is he has a passion for teaching, and he actually started his career as a teacher. So I'm hoping we can learn something about the payment industry today. Please welcome Brendan.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed the discussion with Jeff and Johnny. I think you're going to see a lot of similarities between what they said and what I'm going to get into in the next 15 minutes or so. So, I was asked to just speak for a brief few minutes on really the benefits that we at Visa see around digital payments and what we can bring to the development of urban areas, and particularly cities of the future. So upon this request, I thought, I'm in product strategy right now. came from public policy. There was a number of different things that we could talk about. We could talk about really the saturation of the payments industry, the growth of fintech, really the product portfolio that we at Visa and our competitors and partners are driving, which is highly interesting. We can talk about financial inclusion. We can talk about public-private partnerships and really the engagement that we have with governments to develop cities and other municipal stakeholder partnerships. But I thought, given the audience and given that there is a real opportunity to look at some of the details of really what the economic impact is, I thought it would be interesting for everyone to see what the findings of a study that we did a couple years ago, really groundbreaking study on the economic and the financial impact for cities stakeholders across the ecosystem, and that being the government, businesses, and the citizens, the residents of the city. So I would venture to guess that most people in this room probably understand the theoretical benefits of digital payments and what they bring and the efficiencies that they bring. Things like safety and security and transparency, and hey, you can pay faster, you can get paid faster. That's something that we can all comprehend. But I would also venture to guess that most people in this room, if not everyone, probably doesn't quite know the financial and the economic benefit that those efficiencies bring. And so that's what I want to take us through. And then I can also take us through a little bit of what we at Visa are doing in terms of our road mapping to work with municipal governments and commercial sector partners to really reach those economic gains. Quick disclaimer, this is not financial nor legal advice. Had to say that. So from our perspective, Visa perspective, what are we looking at? What's the future hold when it comes to municipalities? And we really see, or even just across the globe, we're really seeing 6 different trends, right? So one is things are becoming more digital, right? So now we are at a point where total transactions globally and total revenue, out of that total, more than 50% is now made through digital means, not traditional paper-based means like cash and check. So that was a huge inflection point, and it's growing. So that I would say that that's quite obvious to the group in the room here. But a few things that maybe aren't as obvious is that there are more acceptance points and there are new payment form factors. So in that regard, we're looking at beyond the traditional retail engagement with merchants, where you go in, you have a payment product like a card, and you're able to make that payment. Now we actually have what's called the reverse flow. So you can work over the Visa network and other networks to get a real-time disbursement of funds, and that will quickly replace the traditional use of check, or what we call slow ACH, where it could take up to a week to receive funds. So we're talking within 30 minutes for smaller transactions, within 24 hours for much larger transactions, like on a B2B basis. You're going to see much quicker disbursements of funds. What else we're going to see is, there are more players. I mean, we're seeing that it's very pervasive. So 20 years ago, we were in a bit of an antiquated payment system payment industry where you had small players, and it was really that traditional retail payment play. Now, with the rise of fintechs and with the rise of really our partnerships, you're seeing this much more integrated ecosystem, and it's going to continue to get more integrated. And so opportunities are going to rise more quickly. And what we used to recognize as our main competitors are now some of our primary partners. And certainly there are more consumers. So between the years of 2011 and 2017, the World Bank Findex report reported that there was a 37% drop in the number of unbanked individuals across the globe. So we're seeing more consumers globally come online, and that's a priority for a company like Visa, regardless of where you are or who you are. Supporting the development of the economic development, the economic empowerment of individuals to become online so that they have more economic freedom. And then lastly, there's the increase in government involvement. And this is going to continue to be the case. Regulation in the payments industry and the financial services industry is going to continue to become more involved. Regulators are going to become more involved. Regulation is going to be more pervasive. And that's something that we deal with. And we look at governments as partners. I think, especially here in Silicon Valley, government is kind of on a blacklist for a lot of people. They feel like, government just slows things down. I have a completely different perspective. I think that, government is a key partner, and you shouldn't neglect that opportunity. So when we look at smart cities specifically, what's the roadmap that a company like Visa is really focusing on? And there's quite a few different endpoints that we're really driving towards. And I think it's important to first define what we see as a smart city, or how we define a smart city. And that's, it's an urban environment. It appropriately leverages technology and connectivity to, and this is the most important part, to improve the quality of life for everyone, for all stakeholders. And we have constituents and businesses on this slide. I want to include the government as well. And, that's what this study that I'm about to take you through really sought to do, is look at the benefits across the board, across the ecosystem, regardless of social class, regardless of whether it's private or public sector. We have a number of different opportunities, a number of different products in this industry that can really drive the development. And it's just it's just really a priority of how are you most efficient. So I won't go into all of these different endpoints right now, but I will say that there are quite a few that we are focusing on. And one important connection point, given that I am from Visa, that we need to make here is that digital payments is a primary component of each one of these. So if you're online, you need to have the ability to make a payment to make things go through. And so if you look from smart water to traffic, smart economy, smart mobility, there should always be a payment form factor so that you can really grasp those efficiencies. So let's get to the efficiencies. Let's get to the economic and the financial benefits that we would realize through those priorities. So what we did a couple years ago is we looked at, we didn't know exactly what the benefits were economically on a city or financially on businesses and consumers, the city's residents. And we said, given, and as Jeff said earlier this morning, cities are growing. The influence of cities are growing exponentially, and they'll continue to do so. So let's focus on the cities. There's been a lot of research already on really the macro level economic impact of digital payments. Let's get down to the micro level, and let's look at how individual businesses, and governments at the local level are reacting to the growth of these digital payments. And let's really create that nexus, connecting the trends of digital payment growth with what the opportunities are that we're seeing in the financial freedom. So what we decided is, we said, okay, look, we don't want to neglect certain classes of cities, certain levels of development of cities. Let's really, if we're going to do an engagement like this, let's go all out, and let's really drive at the hypothesis that no matter who you are or where you are, you're going to find a positive financial benefit from adopting a greater amount of digital payments. So we looked at 100 cities across the world, and cities at all levels of development, and we dove in. And we decided to segment these 100 cities into 5 different categories of digital payment maturity. And you can see if you go left to right, you will see the level of development. So a cash-centric city, and a good example of that might be a Lagos, Nigeria, or maybe a Kingston, Jamaica. These are the cities that are pretty much, the individuals and businesses are still operating in cash a vast majority of time. And the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, just isn't there yet. As you move up the spectrum, starting with digitally transition and digital leader, you see development, real significant development across either one or both of the two main categories of infrastructure or digital payment behavior by the businesses and the individuals. So once you get to digital leader, and a good example of that might be a Stockholm, Sweden, or a Sydney. And you look at this and you say, and over 95% of individuals in these particular cities are banked. They transact nearly 100% digitally, rarely carry cash, and the digital infrastructure is optimal. It's the best in the world. The US, the American cities that we studied, and we studied 5 cities, none of them fell in the digital leader category. They all fell in digitally advanced. And that's because relative to other industrialized countries, the US has a significant unbanked or underbanked population. We have about, as of a couple years ago, 7% of American residents did not have a bank account. And so when you're sitting in Australia or the Nordics and you're looking at that stat, you're just completely baffled. Our infrastructure's there, but our payment behavior is not. Plus, we have this very legacy habit of using check. So this gives you a bit of an idea of what we studied. Really, it truly was a global study. And then we looked into, really those a couple of different processes. So first looked at, okay, what are the impacts on the consumers, businesses, and government financially? So essentially, at the end of the year, how much more money they have in their pockets, the bank accounts. But we also dove into what we term the catalytic benefits. And those impacts are the pure macro level economic impacts. So for a city, what's GDP growth, job growth, wage production, productivity? What is that looking like when you have these main stakeholders in the city with more money in their pocket? And this is what we found. Now, this is the global average across the 100 cities that I referred to. And we saw over the course of 15 years, the total net benefits across the 100 cities would amount to $470 billion. And if you see, I won't go into too much detail here, I just have a couple minutes left, but when you see across this top row, you look at consumer, that's residents of the cities, you're looking at $28 billion impact, 312 for businesses, 130 billion for government. Businesses are they're gonna be larger naturally, just because there are more flows. So in the second row, the bottom row, you'll see the macro level economic impact, and it's significant. In total additional economic activity of $12 trillion over 15 years. And the follow-on economic impacts of average annual GDP growth. Now, what I mean by that is not necessarily a 19 basis point growth, but more of an add-on to what the projected growth was. So significant gains. And then bringing it a little bit closer to home, San Francisco was one of the 100 that we studied. And you can see that for one city, our local city, there's a significant impact. We're looking at consumers with, earning, over 15 years with nearly 400 million in their pockets. Businesses at 3 billion and government at 1.6 billion. And then the follow-on catalytic economic impacts. So this was a groundbreaking study, a game-changing study, no less. And one that can really give us a lot of insight into what are those economic gains. We know that the trends for the efficiencies, we like having digital payments. We didn't know whether it was a financial benefit or not, positive economic benefit. This is the study that shows that it is. Regardless of who you are or where you are around the world, the more you transact digitally as opposed to cash and check, the more of a financial impact, a net positive financial impact you'll have. So with that, one thing I'll leave you with is that there are still 5 dependencies that our society has in mitigating the transition to this clearly beneficial usage of digital payments. And it starts from the left to the right, limited access to digital payments products, which you'll see essentially in developing markets, along with inadequate digital infrastructure. But of course, in the more developed markets, like in Japan or the US, you have a cultural and habitual attachment to cash. Security and privacy concerns, of course, is a global, global mindset. And then a misperception, the cost of accepting digital payments and are higher than cash is something that we're trying to debunk with this study, but is quite pervasive. So, you know, we're still getting there, but it's interesting to see what the benefits are as our society trends towards more digital connectivity. So I'll leave you with that. Happy to answer any questions related to the study or anything else related to the fintech industry later today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Brendan. All right, so next up we have Ian Goldsmith, who's the Chief Product Officer at Waycare, where he shapes the product and market strategies. And for those of you who may not be aware, Waycare is a company that manages vehicle and traffic data to optimize traffic flow. And so he'll be talking to us about AI and vehicle data. His background, just a bit, he's formerly VP of Product Management at Acona. And a fun fact is he once threw himself off a cliff to avoid being bit by a snake. Please welcome Ian.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a long story, but I will summarize. Basically, when you're English and you've never seen a snake, and you find yourself 120 feet up a cliff in Colorado leading a relatively easy 511, and you mantle onto a ledge and find yourself face to face with a rattlesnake, you very quickly learn whether your fear of snakes trumps your fear of falling. In my case, fear of falling was trivial compared to the snake. For all I know, the snake may well have been dead, but I wasn't willing to take the chance. All right, so Waycare, what are we? We're a suite of cloud-based products primarily focused on the AI-driven predictive analytics of data that comes from a huge range of sources all around traffic. What we're really focusing on is two things: identifying incidents more quickly and accurately, and predicting where incidents may occur. Incidents kind of a broad term, but really in traffic terms it means two things: congestion and crashes. So we're deployed in a number of cities, but our kind of flagship customer is the city of Las Vegas. I assume most of you have been to Vegas, so you probably have a sense of the traffic challenges they face, which have been exacerbated in recent years by a project called Neon, where they're upgrading their entire city infrastructure, all the streets, to be smart streets. So putting in place variable speed limits and a whole bunch of digital messaging signs, the ability to close lanes and open lanes at different times based on traffic. And as they go through that build process, to say nothing of building a massive football stadium kind of right in the middle of the city, they've seen a fairly significant increase in both congestion and crashes. By the way, it's kind of hard sometimes to separate congestion from crashes because a lot of crashes happen in the backups leading to congestion, particularly in the modern era, while we're all very focused on our cell phones and much less focused on the road in front of us. And it's remarkably hard to miss the car in front of you when you're looking at something in front of your face. So we see congestion buildups, cars crashing into the back of the queue in front of them. So what do we do about that? Well, we connect to a huge range of different data sources. Some of these are very expensive, some are less expensive. On the left side of the slide, you see the third-party data sources. That's primarily connected vehicle stuff. That's all nice and modern. We have sources like Wejo and Interex that are captive providers to various different car manufacturers. And from those, you can gather a lot of information about the drivers. There are things that we can class as connected vehicles, so in-vehicle apps. Everyone has a phone in their app. In fact, one of the more modern forms of city-built infrastructure sensors is a Bluetooth sensor. Essentially, as your car drives past a sensor, it'll detect the Bluetooth signatures in the car and will try to analyze how many people are inside the car, not just how fast the car's going and where it's going. On the left side, the right side, let me see. Yeah, your right as well as my right. On the right side of the slide, you also see the infrastructure stuff. Now, those are very expensive. Those are things that sit in the roadways, inductive loop sensors, cameras, all sorts of things that the city has to provide and furnish. We connect to all of those things. Those give you very nice, accurate counts of things. They're very bad at other things like speed. but counting things and understanding when things have stopped at traffic lights and stuff like that, the infrastructure is pretty good at. There's a whole bunch of other things that's starting to feed in there. We see dash cams and vendors like Nexar who provide video analysis of dash cam footage to look for things like active construction zones. Whole bunch of challenges we can get into around that, but I'll skip that for now. One of the things that does get interesting around the in-vehicle stuff is that in addition to just basic where is the car and how fast is it going, we're starting to see in-vehicle behaviors that are commonly called safety events in the industry. So swerving, heavy braking, excessive acceleration, things like that can become a pretty interesting source of insights into what's happening on the streets. There's not quite enough of that data out there yet, and as that data grows, we're going to start running into other infrastructure limits around 4G cellular networks, which is why the advent of 5G will make things even more interesting. When you have more than probably 1 or 2% of the vehicles on the road providing pretty accurate in-vehicle data around those types of events, you can start to generate some pretty good statistical correlation around what's really going on the road. And you end up with what you can think of as a virtual sensor. So instead of having to put an inductive loop on the ground in front of a traffic light to figure out how many cars stopped on the way to that light, you can now start to gather that information from connected vehicle sources and be pretty accurate in your overall understanding of what's happening on the roads. So what do we do with all of that data? Well, we suck it all in on the left side, lots of different data sources. We run it through some magic in the middle, all sorts of different kinds of AI at play, from basic algorithmic machine learning through pretty deep neural networks doing various different things. And we drive a number of services on the right side of the slide. So our primary scenario is we're deployed inside the traffic management center or the operations center. Those are, those rooms with lots of screens all over the walls. Vegas is particularly impressive. And we are identifying incidents typically about 12 minutes before they're called in from any kind of 911 service or picked up by any of the city infrastructure. It's a pretty big deal. A little bit of a misleading stat, because in the event of a major accident, 911 gets called pretty quickly. But we're still picking up minor incidents and medium-level incidents very, very quickly compared to typical infrastructure. And that's a big deal, because it allows us to get first responders on scene much more quickly. So when you look at the Vegas Traffic Management Center, on one of those, I think, 60 screens they have all over the place, you'll have our application running. On every single Traffic Management Center operator's workstation, one of their 7 monitors will have our application running. They'll be using that to understand where incidents are appearing so they can decide how to react. The first thing they have to do is confirm the incident. Tons of cameras around Vegas, so they can fire up a camera pointed in the right place, verify that an incident's there. Why do they need to confirm it? Well, maybe it came in from Waze. Waze is crowdsourced, so it's user-generated. There are a lot of people that don't seem to know what they're doing with Waze. So you're driving along the road, you think you see an incident. By the time you're done fumbling with your phone and reporting it, you're 5 miles further down the freeway, but you decide to report it anyway. So there's a lot of stuff you have to do, or we have to do, through both our AI to filter those kind of things, and then also the operators have to do to generate that. Okay, so we've identified incidents. So what? We're able to deploy police. We're able to get emergency services out there. We're able to reroute traffic. We're able to fire up digital message signs, close lanes, change all sorts of things, take lots of different actions. But that's not really where it gets interesting. Where it gets more interesting is on the predictive side of things. So we're able to take all of these data sources, train neural networks to look at a typical flow of traffic. And it's not just data from the traffic stuff. It's we get a data feed from Ticketmaster, so we know what events are going on. That, as you can imagine, that's crazy complex in Vegas. But there are certain times of year when things get particularly ugly, like around CES. There's an enormous amount of traffic increase driven by that show alone. We take weather feeds. You may think that's not all that relevant in Vegas, but the heat causes a lot of breakdowns. So we start to understand that. When there is rain, it's really bad because the roads get very greasy from long periods of having no rain. So we understand, okay, it's going to rain tomorrow. That will change risk in certain areas. But most of what we're doing is looking at that historic pattern, building a baseline, and then looking at current data feeds and traffic flows to predict risk. So essentially what we're saying is we think there's a high risk of an accident right here, and here, and here. We provide a prioritized list of high-risk areas. Again, so what? What do you do with that? Well, what we can do is a number of things. It starts with lighting up freeway signs to warn people of high-risk areas. Going forward, we would hope that we'd be able to directly feed information into autonomous vehicles. So you're cruising along in your Tesla, and it suddenly decides, hey, this is a really bad idea. I'm going to get off this road and go somewhere else, ideally. Or more likely, it just slows itself down and understands that you're doing the right thing. Even today, we can push those kind of alerts and warnings out to Waze. So hopefully, drivers are paying attention to what their navigation systems are telling them. They're able to take action, do different things. The most effective mechanism today for preventing crashes, which is what we're talking about when we talk about reducing risk, is putting a police car with its blue lights flashing at the side of the road. I think something like 91% of drivers that were exceeding the speed limit reduce their speed to the speed limit or lower when they see a police car at the side of the road. We all ignore speed limits. I know I do. I got a very nice performance award from the California Highway Patrol about 4 weeks ago. Comes in a nice little yellow form, and they give you a date to appear in court when they present it to you. It was quite exciting. And speed is what causes crashes. A huge number of crashes are caused by high speed. So if we can reduce speed, we reduce crashes. So by positioning police on the side of the road with those lights flashing, we slow the traffic down, we reduce the risk. Now, you do run into kind of a Heisenberg problem with this, right? We're trying to predict crashes, but morals and ethics say, well, we can't just do nothing about that and let the crash happen to prove the accuracy of our predictive model. So we then decide, okay, well, it's probably better to prevent the crash, but by preventing it, it never happens, so now you cast doubt on your own predictive skills. But anyway, we'd prefer to reduce that. But what you can do is run pilots and compare your current models to previous models. So what we do is break down traffic into 2-hour segments, break down the predictions into 2-hour segments, prioritized across the region. So in Vegas, there are currently, I think, 9 different locations where the police have set up stations where it's safe for the police officer to park at the side of the roads with lights on. You can't just sort of randomly pull up on the shoulder of a freeway and set your lights flashing. That would be dangerous. So we've identified 9 locations, and we prioritize those for every 2-hour slot through the day. Sometimes there's no particular risk, so we don't prioritize a location at all. It's then up to Nevada Highway Patrol to determine who gets assigned where, which officer gets located. They don't have 9 officers spare to sit at the side of the road with their lights flashing. So they pick 2, 3, 4 officers, assign them to those locations in key times. In fact, during the pilot, we had 2 officers available. So we had 2 people assigned to different prioritized locations. We kept it to a very limited area so we could do a pretty precise correlation of data before the preventative measures and afterwards. And what we saw was a 17% reduction in primary crashes. Now, what that means is that over the 6 weeks of the pilot, we project that there were 37 fewer crashes. Now, not all of these crashes are serious, but every crash results in a substantial congestion increase. From a city perspective, congestion is expensive. Essentially, congestion is stealing taxpayer money because taxpayers have paid for that throughput on the infrastructure. When you have a traffic incident, it slows down the traffic, reduces that capacity, and that's basically a taxpayer problem. You can also look at it the way that the US Department of Transportation does and say, okay, well, let's analyze the cost of crashes. And a fatal accident averaged through the US costs $9 million. And it's kind of hard to look at fatalities in terms of money because really there's a far more obvious human impact. But from a purely economic perspective, that's a lot of money. Nevada, for some reason, is cheaper. It's about $6.5 million per fatality in Nevada. I don't know why that is, and I'm not prepared to comment. But so the results of the pilot were pretty substantial. As said, 17% reduction in primary crashes. We identified 20% more incidents during the course of that pilot. That means that Each time we identify an incident, we can get a resource on scene more quickly. We can get freeway service patrol there to tow a car out of the way, city maintenance on scene to fix something simple like a broken light pole, which can, again, increase the risk of crashes. 180% increase in public outreach. What does that mean? That means that when we identify an incident, we push it out through Gov Delivery or Twitter so that the general public is aware that there's something going on the street. Already talked about the 91% of drivers slowing down. That's a big deal. But obviously you can't just randomly deploy police cars all over the city. That wouldn't be effective. Plus people would start ignoring them pretty quickly. In fact, I assume a lot of people here use Waze. Everyone sees on Waze, you see the little police thing popping up every now and then, warning you to slow down. Well, the Nevada Highway Patrol's onto you on that one. They have officers who regularly drive along the freeway just clicking the button to say, police, police, police. So they mark themselves as present along the side of the road just to force people to slow down, which in turn makes people ignore that stuff even more. And then a greater than 10-minute response time by law enforcement, actually 12 minutes, which again is a pretty big deal in terms of speeding up responses, saving lives. Everyone talks about the golden hour of response in a trauma incident. So taking 12 minutes off that golden hour is big. That's it. Any questions about AI and traffic? Happy to take them later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. All right, so that wraps up our best practices. Next up, we're going to be having a panel, which I personally find really exciting and really interesting. It's around vehicle autonomy. And so I think, years and years ago, we kind of saw vehicle autonomy as something that, is sci-fi or not realistic or something that's kind of, crazy. And I think now more and more, we're kind of expecting it to be almost inevitable. And so I'm curious to know, we're going to do an exercise. So just by show of hands, who's looking forward to living in a world with vehicle autonomy? Okay, and who does it terrify? Does it terrify anybody? Anybody scared of living in that world? Nobody going to admit it? One person? Okay, and finally, who kind of finds themselves somewhere in the middle? All right, who forgot to answer the question? I see you. Okay, so yeah, for this panel, we have Billy Riggs, who's an expert in mobility and housing and urban development. He's a professor at University of San Francisco. He's a consultant, and in his spare time, he's written over 100 publications, which have been published in places like Wall Street Journal and The Economist. We have Regina Clulow, who's CEO and co-founder of Populous. Sean Harrington, who's VP of City Solutions at Verizon. Pierre Maillard, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Senior Tech Advisor at Bosch. Thank you. And Bita Sistani, who's the Director of Automotive Marketing at Samsung. Please welcome all to the stage.
All right. Thank you all for being here, and thank to these wonderful panelists for being here. So we're going to maybe start off with some quick introductions from our panelists, and so let's start off with Regina.
Hi there, it's great to be here. I'm a Bay Area native, actually originally from San Jose, so enjoyed the trip down. At Populous, we're building a platform for cities to help manage the future of mobility. One of the biggest challenges that we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years is the rapid emergence of shared mobility services. First, Uber and Lyft, followed by, most recently, waves and waves of dockless scooters that have landed in now over 300 cities. And what we're building at Populous is a platform that helps cities gain insights about how these new services that are being launched change travel patterns so that they can steer progress towards important societal goals that we all care about, equity, sustainability, and efficiency. At the end of the day, most private fleet operators aren't necessarily naturally incentivized to meet public goals. And so it's really important to put data in the hands of cities. In just 1 year, our platform is now being used in over 50 cities around the world, mostly in North America, but also now in Europe and in Latin America. We work with the largest fleet operators, including Uber, Lyft, Bird, Lime, and Grow. And we're really excited to really deliver solutions that cities can use to help steer the future towards goals that we all care about so that we can move more safely, efficiently, and sustainably.
Right, Sean, thanks.
Excellent. And I was just in Santa Monica last weekend, which appears to be ground zero for scooters. We had options galore. So I lead product development for Verizon's smart community business, located just down the road here in San Jose, and came from a tech startup background, having been here in the Valley for the last 15 years. Most recently was the COO of a company called Sensity Systems, which was really taking advantage of this transition of streetlights to LED to enable a whole suite of smart city applications. Came into Verizon, and this is where the story starts to intersect with autonomous mobility, the conversation we're going to have today, in that the technology that's being deployed by cities to help ease congestion, better manage the flow of vehicles, scooters, pedestrians around the city, through some of the analytics platforms that you've seen presented today, is some of the same technology that's going to be critical for enabling autonomous mobility at the safety level and at the quality of service level that everybody is going to expect. In addition to, of course, Verizon and the core network with 5G helping to provide some of the connectivity needs with the latency and bandwidth that comes with trying to address autonomous mobility, and all the related use cases. So that's the role that Verizon plays in this new landscape of autonomous mobility, and look forward to talking more about it today.
Hi, my name is Bita Sistani, and I'm Automotive Business Development Director for Samsung Electronics. A little bit about myself. My entire career has been in the semiconductor world, so I live and breathe everything related to semiconductors. I've been in the automotive segment since about 2008. I have to say I started traveling to Detroit right around the same time that GM was letting go of 10,000 people, and all the companies are laying off. And it has been amazing to see this change in technology going from an industry that was way behind the rest of the technology world, such as mobile, coming and trying to catch up. And now, in some aspect, we see that they're trying to leap ahead. So I'm hoping I bring in more of a semiconductor and component supplier into this segment, to this panel.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pierre Maillot. I'm Business Development Director in charge of smart communities in North America. You might know Bosch for the appliances or power tools, but it's actually a big group where we leverage our technical expertise in sensor, software, and services in different domains to develop IoT solutions in building, energy, security, and obviously mobility. So as far as mobility is concerned, we are the largest supplier of automotive equipment for car makers in the world. We supply sensors, radars, and this will be then leveraged for enabling autonomous driving. We have currently a partnership with Daimler where we are working on autonomous driving software. So that's the knowledge and the technology which are inside the vehicle. And on the other hand, we are leveraging some of our video surveillance analytics and intelligence to also develop smarter infrastructure. So I don't know how much of you are in the Bay Area, but most of the camera on the bridge in the Bay Area are Bosch camera. They provide so-called ITS, Intelligent Transportation System solution, with traffic management, wrong way, lane detection. So probably you heard about the accident on the 101 a few days ago where there were 4 people who died in a crash. Someone took the 101 on the wrong way. Now we are working with camera to detect wrong way, and then when the vehicle will be fully connected, hopefully this can be also translated into a safer autonomy.
All right, so we're already jumping into kind of some examples of kind of infrastructural as well as very tacit equipment-based gestures towards automation. So I kind of wanted to pivot back to the rest of the members of the panel and kind of how do you see the kind of smart mobility and the future of automation and mobility in general in cities relating to what you do?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to kick off. So right now, we're really enabling cities to communicate information also back to operators. One of the interesting things that's emerged with dockless scooters is that cities are now able to ask for information, but they are also able to more easily regulate those services and indicate where they should, for instance, be parked so that it's safer for pedestrians to walk on sidewalks, where those vehicles should ride a little bit slower. And so we're now helping cities harness big data in order to identify where are appropriate parking spaces for scooters in Arlington. Arlington County has been really proactive since they arrived on the ground over a year ago in carving off on-street parking for scooters. They've been actually taking away on-street parking from cars and then dedicating them. One car spot can now fit 15 bikes and scooters, and now those scooters can ride more safely and be parked more safely. And so this is, I think, the early stages of cities really taking more control of how now private fleets, which we expect a lot of autonomous vehicle services to be delivered through, how cities can now interact with them, because at the end of the day, there is this critical infrastructure component that only cities can manage, and they need to be able to interact with those vehicles.
Thanks, Regina.
So just a little bit of context. I mentioned Sensity, where I had worked previously as COO, and that led to my arrival at Verizon. Verizon has been investing for the last few years quite heavily in this smart cities space, in part because as we roll out our 5G network, we are deploying fiber, we have to deploy radios in a much more dense fashion than we have ever before, which means working closely with cities to go put in place the infrastructure for our network, but at the same time realize that that's the perfect opportunity to also put in place sensors and analytics, so software tied to those sensors, close to the sensors in some cases, right next to the sensor in a camera, a smart camera system, for example, mentioned by Pierre. And so we realized that this was not just about deploying the network, but an opportunity for us to get quite heavily into the smart community space and be able to offer the cities more than just, hey, we are here to enable your citizens with wireless or wireline connectivity, but rather we can go help address congestion, parking challenges, public safety challenges, smart lighting challenges. And with that, over time, what we've seen is that as we look at autonomous mobility, one of the key challenges is how do you augment what the vehicle can see with data coming from the infrastructure? And this is the whole area of cellular vehicle to everything technology, where the entire industry recognizes that while the car manufacturers are going to have to meet a very high bar to deliver an autonomous experience, particularly level 5, that meets the expectations that we all put on them, which is this safety standard better than any human driver could achieve. And yet there's still so much opportunity to go much further beyond that and increase safety and the performance and the experience in the car by taking data from the infrastructure. So we've started to do pilots where we are working with cities as well as the car manufacturers to show how you can take a simple situation like a camera that sees that a car that is turning left may actually hit an oncoming vehicle that they can't see because it's occluded by another vehicle in a neighboring lane, and then deliver that as an automated active safety measure, either through automated braking or an alert in the vehicle. This is super exciting. It is going to be a major part of the story around autonomous mobility, and we're just getting started in that process now. But it is evolving absolutely, at breakneck pace in partnership with the entire ecosystem, including the OEMs, but also companies like Bosch that have, part of the technology solution.
So I want to actually dig a little bit deep into the 5G. The reason we talk about 5G is sort of like as if it's solving the world hunger. But let's talk about why. One of the reasons is because 5G brings in this accuracy and low latency that is extremely crucial for autonomous driving. I give you a little bit of example. Our mobile group at Samsung, they were actually recently doing a demo of 5G modems at an event in London. It was a festival of speed, if some of you guys know about that event. They actually use autonomous driving, so they had a remote operator taking over a car without a driver over a 5G. And the amount of accuracy that was needed in order to go through some of the hurdles, it was just unbelievable compared to the pilot program that was done over 4G. So I think as a semiconductor provider, while we are bringing all these modules and a product inside the car, as well as working with ecosystem to bring it into actually entire ecosystem.
So Pierre, before you answer that, I think maybe if you could speak to a little more to kind of what's the built environment implications of some of this, because we tend to think with automation that it's all about the vehicle. And when I give lectures, I say that the autonomous vehicles have a lot more, that they can transform than just our way of travel. So maybe we could talk about automation in other ways and sensoring in other ways as well. And Regina, I'd like to hear from you in terms of how we think about travel choices and travel behavior, and how maybe some of this data might really reinform the way we travel in terms of city greenhouse gas goals and things like that.
So yeah, maybe I just like most of the things have been said. I mean, like the main objective of vehicle autonomy will be to address traffic and safety. And to your point, when we come about how to facilitate and to speed up the adoption of autonomy in the urban life, we have to think about like a very long transition. It's not going to be one day to the other that all the cars are going to drive autonomously. That's why infrastructure become very important, because there are opportunities where you can leverage close infrastructure topic to really address this autonomous driving. So for example, like with the city of Columbus in Ohio, who won the Smart City Challenge a few years ago, we have developed a smart mobility corridor where we are using this camera that I was referring before to increase and improve traffic performance. Also, autonomous driving, I think, will be implemented first in closed environments. So for example, like shuttle loop on private roads, or also parking garage. So for example, we are working on a solution where the car will go into a parking garage infrastructure. The infrastructure will be upgraded with sensors and camera, and then there will be an app which enable you to get your car drive to the parking spots by itself. It brings additional safety, but it also brings economics to the parking garage developer to actually get higher density and then develop a parking garage in a way that it can also be repurposed in the future so that you avoid stranded assets. And we talked about public-private partnership in the past. That's where cities can partner with private developer to build solution which will then ultimately impact the traffic in the city.
So I used to, prior to having founded Populous, I was a transportation researcher, did a PhD at MIT, and then was a transportation research scientist at Stanford and UC Berkeley. And one of the key areas of my research was looking at the impacts of new mobility services on travel behavior, and then further than that, on our greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation is growing as the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in California, but also in the United States. And one of the reasons that it is it's really hard to regulate and change people's travel choices. Super hard. And one of the key levers is really the built environment. So my fears around autonomous vehicles are that we will continue to plan and prioritize for single occupancy vehicles. The hell scenario, how many have heard of the heaven and hell scenario for autonomous vehicles? Okay, so
Would you like to give a brief lecture?
In the weird environmental world that we operate in, Billy, the heaven and hell scenarios are The hell scenario is that we continue to carve off our public space for single occupancy vehicles. People use autonomous vehicles by themselves, and then they also allow them to drive around and pick up their laundry and pick up their pets, etc. And so we generate more miles on the road, we generate more congestion, and we generate way more greenhouse gas emissions.
And I think what Regina is being rather coy about is she and another number of other researchers here in California have really started to unpack what is happening, for example, with transportation network companies. We're already seeing a boost in vehicle miles traveled. My research team did some work in Boston over the summer. We found the same thing happening, that we weren't recruiting new travelers, out of vehicles in many of these shared vehicles. These were actually people that had taken transit. So I mean, I think there's, when we think about some of the pitfalls of autonomy, it's important to focus on this travel behavior piece. But so maybe for the rest of the panelists, kind of if we were to think about infrastructure that could help this, an ecosystem or travel ecosystem that might facilitate better travel decisions and accommodate autonomous vehicles, whether or not they're shared or driven alone, what would that look like? What would it take in terms of an infrastructure standpoint?
Well, I would just start with the fundamentals. Obviously, working for Verizon, we think a lot about connectivity because that's the backbone for collecting and moving data to be used for one of these applications. So if you look at mobility in particular, whether it's in the vehicle and the sensors that are there, you have terabytes of data that are being generated per day from camera sensors, LiDAR sensors, a whole variety of other sensors. And then now we've got an increasing number of devices in people's pockets or installed on traffic lights or street lights. And all of that data needs to be processed in some way. And so what we see is a need to not only increase the speeds because you've got so much data that has to be moved around, but importantly, and this comes with this evolution or revolution to 5G, the utilization of compute throughout the network. And what I mean by that is it's not so simple that, hey, as long as we have this lightning fast network, we ought to be able to then take data from sensors and send them all the way back to the cloud, process them centrally, and then send back information. We need to be able to put compute throughout the network closer to the sensors. So one component of 5G is what we call mobile edge compute, or the MAC, where we can take some of that sensor data, process it in a local area, and then deliver the insights back to a car or to a pedestrian, any type of alerting, in real time. I bring all of that up because if we're going to be able to take autonomous mobility in the direction we all want, which is the heaven scenario you didn't get to describe, but there is a heaven side of the coin, which is that we actually, we enable much more efficient travel because vehicles have information about the traffic signals and when they're going to change, and you just can't enable that efficiency through human behavior. You have to have some type of AI system. If we're going to do that, then we have to be able to deploy the data, and the analytics that are processing that data efficiently, and from right next to the device all the way back to the cloud. And I do think there is that that heaven scenario, which is we reduce the number of miles because cars are utilized far more efficiently, both in terms of number of passengers in them and also how far they travel to get things done. But it's going to take a significant effort and investment, not just by the car companies, but by those who have an impact on the infrastructure.
All right. Actually, you said it really well, and I have to agree with you. So from the amount of compute that's needed inside the car, an autonomous car, in order to make decisions, in order to run the processors and so on, all the way to the data collected. So there's a vast amount of information that needs to be exchanged. However, we are still in early phases, in my opinion, of how much of this data we need to keep, how much of it we need to store or send back to cloud and come back and bring it back for more analysis or sharing. So for me, is basically seamless operation between inside the car to cloud edge, and back is quite important. I think that's the big picture.
Beer, did you want to add anything, or did you?
I mean, we have been talking a lot about like the technology inside the infrastructure. I think we could also extend the conversation to the road infrastructure itself. Obviously, when you have already a CLT which is built, you have less opportunities. You need to retrofit the infrastructure. But when you have opportunities to develop a new community, then you can think through the design of and the planning of these communities holistically by anticipating how mobility will affect the mobility in the future. So that being said, with what we have been seeing regarding the mobility as a service and ride sharing, and hopefully reduction of personal car ownership, you can think through parking as a different way. Especially for developers, it costs a lot of money to actually build parking, whether it's underground or attached to a home. You could think through a detached parking garage, and then it's obviously the technology who is going to enable you to do that, but also all the different mobility solutions which has attached and interconnected to that. So micro-mobility solution, first mile, last mile, maybe autonomous shuttle. And then you give back the road to the pedestrian by planning and designing a community which will be embracing the technology in a much better way. And that is feasible for very urban and dense environments. The challenge that I see is, especially in the US, also in France, there are still a lot of people living in the countryside, and they will still rely on their car, and they might not have the same access in terms of mobility and so on. So you need to also think about like how you connect those people to the city and how you basically create a seamless experience in terms of mobility for the technology infrastructure, but also the actually land infrastructure.
I love it. I love it. We tend to have an urban bias here in our wonderful Bay Area, and it's important to remember we have those kinds of communities here in California as well. Just kind of ripping off that, I mean, we had a discussion a little earlier about kind of this kind of interplay between, or this dialogue that, well, maybe cars won't need infrastructure, and are these infrastructure investments that cities make, are they really defunct in 5 years? And I think you all were kind of deconstructing some of the suggestions that's not accurate. Maybe you, Vita, you and Sean were pretty firm on that. Could you deconstruct that a little bit?
Yeah. So basically, some of the infrastructures have to be here for more than 10 years. We are designing for infrastructures that are going to be out there for probably cars are the easiest one, 10 years. But if you are designing for IoT, sometimes a tractor has to be out there for 40 years. So you sort of need to have a balance between short-term technology adaptation and long-term sustainable seamless support. So I think we will have that challenge continuing, and but that's for us to solve.
I mean, I just sort of two different lenses on it. One is technology, one is the sort of business model. On the technology front, yes, of course, as providers of this technology, we have to be very thoughtful about how long we expect the technology to last out in the field and be modular in our approach where needed, such that we can go and make upgrades along with technology development. We absolutely can't, as a collective community, get stuck in the fear cycle of obsolescence where we just don't do anything ever because it's always, it's moving so fast. I mean, no progress would be made if we all feared that. At the same time, when my team goes and develops a smart camera-based detection system for transportation management, we also can't assume that it's got a one-year life and we're just going to go out and roll trucks and go 30 feet up in the air and put new ones up every year because there's a new GPU from NVIDIA or whatever it is. Therefore, we want to take advantage of it. We have to be thoughtful about that, and I think that's happening. And there's certainly enough value in the outcomes that come with deploying this technology that can be quantified that make it worthwhile. On the business model front, one thing I just do want to mention is, with the movement toward autonomous and the car companies viewing themselves as mobility service providers as opposed to manufacturer of vehicles, there is an opportunity for the technology that is useful for cities for reducing congestion to be bundled into the value proposition for those who are using those mobility services. What's a simple example? Today, you buy cars, an Audi as an example, you can pay a subscription fee and get information about the prediction of when the traffic signal you're sitting in front of is going to change from, red to green so that you know how much time you have to send a text message while you're sitting at the traffic light or not. And that's just a minor point, but the idea that the cities have to bear all of the burden of going and deploying this technology, I think is shifting as we see that some of the value that gets accrued by the drivers or the users of those mobility services can help fund some of this technology deployment.
One more item. So I think one of the really big challenges as cities are looking to transition to the future is that a lot of them bear the burden of being locked into legacy contracts with what are typically called systems integrators. So they're selling hardware and software that are bundled together that often don't use open standards, that make it very difficult for a city to then, for instance, upgrade its payment technology. I used to work for Movil, which is the mobility services arm of Daimler, and we were selling mobile ticketing to transit agencies. We launched the Caltrain mobile app, the San Francisco Muni mobile app, and a lot of people often ask, well, why can't you pay for all of these transit systems with your phone or with one app? And the answer is procurement. It's not a technology problem. It's really a function of cities getting locked into vendors. And so I think it's really important as we think about the future of technology in cities, that cities become more aware of how to purchase technology smartly to demand open standards. And that doesn't necessarily mean open source software. It just means standards that are interoperable with other systems so that they can move on flexibly.
Keep that mic, Regina. Just let me follow up here. You can. So, I mean, you're implying that there's a certain amount of tension there. So, what would be the responsibility for the private sector in that scenario you painted, where there is fragmentation and perhaps a need for organizational leadership within a city? How would a private sector organization help in that situation?
I think it's challenging because I think with shared mobility services and with these legacy systems integrators, there's this tension that what is good for the company may not be what's best for the city. So, private companies, the systems integrators, are trying to build a moat. They're trying to make it impossible for a city to move off of their technology. I spent most of my life in the public sector and as an academic, so I'll say that out loud. And I think that tension exists. And what's most important is for the public sector to be more technically aware and knowledgeable, and for private sector folks to move into the public sector and vice versa.
Pierre, you had something to add?
Yeah, I wanted to give another example on how we can think through the challenges of investing in this infrastructure, because it has a cost, and sometimes we have to think through innovative business model. Some people might say, okay, you can leverage the data that is coming from all these sensors in the infrastructure, but then comes the question of data privacy, which we don't want to address now. But I just give you an example of a situation regarding parking. So studies show that 30% of the traffic in the city is due to people looking for a parking spot. There are now solutions which are infrastructure-based to help you find a parking spot. In San Francisco, there is SF Park. There are many ways to do that with a sensor on the ground, with a camera, or whatever. But obviously, there is a cost in installing this infrastructure. What we have been contemplating at Bosch is a solution which we call community-based parking. So basically, we are leveraging the car as the sensor. with all the sensors from the cars that you need to develop future autonomous driving, the car, while it is actually driving, will detect open parking space on street. That will be sent to a cloud where all the people part of this community will actually provide a real-time map of available parking space. So then, if I'm part of this community, I have a real-time map which tell me where I can park, and obviously without any infrastructure investment needed. It's basically everybody is like, contributing to it. So it's an innovative way to actually address parking as a challenge here, and just wanted to throw that out as an example on how we can turn around the financial issue.
So I want to ask each of you, as we kind of bring our discussion on stage to a close, if you were to tell a city or a public sector agency, none of us work for a public sector agency, so if you were to tell them kind of what are the two things you need to do to prepare for this, this autonomous future for self-driving cars, but also buildings that are smarter, that get people from home to work in a more efficient way or home to school in a more efficient way, what do they need to do to prepare? What are the two things they can do now, and when might they need to do them?
All right, so a little bit, I think in my opinion, we all need each other. It's an ecosystem that we cannot do it on our own. For private sector, we have to be profitable in order to bring product into masses and into scale. So each one of us have a role in bringing smart cities to the market. Local government and central government, they're responsible to or they are in charge of bringing those new initiatives. The private sector and maybe technology companies and startups is to bring in those leading edge technology to market and bring it into masses. Universities, they're feeding into this technology leap. So for me, it's cities to work with startups and private sector in more of a trusted advisor altogether, and try to basically bring. We can always think that private sector will do things out of the goodness of their heart. They gotta see revenue. They have to hit targets. So it's sort of like collaboration among all the ecosystem.
That's awesome. You don't make decisions only out of the goodness of your heart? Oh my goodness. I can't believe I'm on the panel with you. A couple quick points. I would say one is, in terms of cities and the public sector in general getting ready for autonomous mobility, there is a need for people within the city government to really understand both technology and policy, and this is evolving quickly, and so making sure that there are the right programs to bring in people, whether it be full-time employees or consultants, experts, to help with some of these meaty issues, I think is going to be really important, because if not, it's just too hard to make the right decisions if you don't have the right level of expertise, and consultation. And then again, I'm biased because I work for Verizon, but being ready for 5G in particular, but investing in infrastructure for connectivity is going to be critical. And we're not the leader in this globally at this point in terms of overall connectivity for citizens. We need to collectively invest in that core infrastructure if we're going to be able to take a leadership position in autonomous mobility and other areas of smart cities. So I would recommend those two practical steps.
So I think the two top areas that I would love to see cities invest in are, number one, a lot of people don't realize that most cities don't have a digital version of their physical space. So things like parking rules are, in many cities, the vast majority of them, they don't exist in a digital form. You're even lucky if they exist in a paper form on some drawing room floor at the agency. that manages parking. And so actually creating better digital replicas of physical space is a huge problem that cities are going to need to solve, because none of these smart traffic solutions are going to work if people don't have a digital version of that physical space that they can access. And the second, which is what we're facilitating at Populous, is really being proactive about requiring access to information from private mobility services that are using the public right-of-way. We basically give our roads away for free in most cities, and cities are now starting to say, you are using that public space that we have provided with taxpayer dollars, we're going to get something in exchange, and that's data. And so we're helping to facilitate that exchange for cities at Populous. I also think they should be charging for that space, and I expect more cities will start to do that in the future as well.
Well, I'm just going to conclude on my side by reflecting on the work that I've been doing over the last 4 years with Master Developer 5 Point, who is developing a new community in San Francisco. And I have a technological background. They actually selected Bosch to be their technological partner and look through the community, and not exclusively mobility, but obviously mobility is a big part of it. And the developer, as well as the cities, they know how to plan new communities. They have this urban planning expertise, but they don't know much about technology. And technological companies like Bosch, like Verizon, Samsung, we have a good technological background, but we have limited knowledge in urban planning. And I think the key for embracing and adopting technology into urban life is having both worlds converge and think through the planning of these communities 5-10 years ahead in order to embrace, adopt this technology, and be evolutive so that we actually can adapt ourselves to the technology. So yeah, that's my takeaway.
Yeah, and I'll just conclude. I think one of the things, if I look at kind of where I've worked over the last 5 years as well, has really been trying to educate the public and academics and industry about how they can collaborate more through a book all about disruptive transport. And we've been hosting an event in San Francisco for the last 3 years focused on automation in cities. Actually, Pierre talked there 3 years ago, just as he was starting that 5-point project. And we have that again November 1st of this year. And I think those are really important efforts from something I heard from everybody. It's really about educating our public and our policymakers, our city planners, our engineers, but also the leaders of the next generation. And the reason I say that is because we heard reference to what's happening with Skywalk Lab in Toronto, and some of these public upwellings of distrust in big tech. And we see the same thing here in the Silicon Valley with numerous lawsuits. And I fully sympathize with some of the lawsuits that have come out against 5G and kind of the fear-mongering that's been created about the health impacts of 5G, which Google and the New York Times there are not health implications in the same way that is being propagated. So I do think that we need to do our part to educate our public, to educate our industry colleagues, as well as to educate the kind of the citizens of tomorrow. So, and I think I heard that from each of you. So I think that's a good way to end us today. Thank you all for participating in this, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, everyone. So that concludes our morning half of the day for the content. Right now we're going to have lunch straight out these doors. It's a really great spread. Please, network, have a great time, but please come back here at 1:15 when we get started in the afternoon. Thanks.
I would love to